Okay, everyone, welcome to the Hilltop Professional Development Institute Educator Discussion Series. Say that 3 times fast. I'm here tonight with the wonderful Monica Bhagwan of Leah's Pantry. Monica is here to talk to us about the impact of trauma on food in our lives, on nutrition, on how we come to define what health and nutrition means to us, and how that impacts our relationships with food and with each other. I'm just checking the chat here to see. I'm having problems accessing the link. Brianne, is anyone else having trouble accessing the sign-in form? I'm as well. Okay, I will get that sorted out for y'all. And we'll send that back into the chat a little bit later in the presentation. Thank you. My name is Becky Krieger. I recently joined the support team for the Professional Institute. I've been a longtime educator at Hilltop, and I might be a new face for many of you who've been coming to our EDS events. The incredible and irreplaceable Mike Brown, who was our fearless leader of the Institute for several years, has stepped into a new role and a new position with a new organization. And we miss him dearly, but we're very excited for him. So you'll be seeing me and Darlene and other members of our staff and team moderating these events now and in the near future. All right, so to begin, before we launch into our presentation, I'd like to first begin with a land acknowledgement. To acknowledge that those of us who are calling in from Seattle, from Washington, we are on the traditional land of the first people of the Duwamish and other Coast Salish tribes, such as the Muckleshoot and the Snoqualmie, among many. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the tribes to which this land belongs. And wherever you're calling in from tonight, acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land. It's important to note that this kind of acknowledgement is not a new practice developed by those of us in colonial institutions, but rather a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. For non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement is a powerful way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous people of this land on which we work and live. It is also a simple way of resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories and honoring and inviting the truth of our history. So tonight we welcome Monica Bhagwan of Leah's Pantry. And Monica has initiated and overseen the application of a trauma-informed lens to food and nutrition programs at Leah's Pantry of San Francisco. She has spent the last 2 decades envisioning and implementing innovative nutrition and food programs that mitigate adversity and offer positive and healing experiences for all. She has a master's degree in food studies from New York University and is a certified trauma support specialist, and has also been a professional cook. If you're unfamiliar with Leah's Pantry, they're a San Francisco-based organization. They are the leading voice for trauma-informed nutrition education. They envision nourished communities and a healthy, equitable food system. Leah's Pantry's mission is to improve the health, wellness, and resilience of communities through trauma-informed nutrition security. So Monica, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of you for showing up after, I'm sure it was a long day for all of you. And with that, Monica, you can get us started.
Thank you so much, Becky. And thank you everyone for inviting me to be here. All those things that Becky said about my bio, I also want to acknowledge that I am in the room of people who have a lot of wisdom, a lot of experiences that I did not have. And so I want to really invite you all to share those experiences and the applications. At Leah's Pantry, we are interfacing with so many different groups and organizations, and that we really draw on every time we speak or present or train, to add to our knowledge base. So I really encourage everyone to participate, and we're going to have some interaction throughout this session. So, like as Becky said, Leah's Pantry envisions nourished communities and a healthy, equitable food system. And our mission is to improve the health, wellness, and resilience of communities throughout through trauma-informed nutrition security. We're California-based, though our footprint reaches across the country at this point, and we've been doing some work up in your area as well. And just quickly, we do a lot of stuff, but our work falls into 3 areas. First, we facilitate workshops in our home communities. So that's California. So we do a lot of implementation and direct service. But we also build capacity of our partner organizations to operationalize trauma-informed principles in nutrition and food security programs, which we like to combine and say nutrition security. So if you hear me say that term, please know that we're talking about the world of nutrition and food for our world. And then last, we participate in collaborative efforts to better integrate our approaches into larger initiatives across settings and sectors and systems. Here's a brief snapshot of the things we offer. I would like to just encourage you, if you want to hear more, we have a lot of resources and trainings. There's so much available. Just find our website and then reach out. We have a very responsive team to tell you what would work best for your program or your site. So a little bit about me. I began applying a trauma-informed lens to community programs in 2010 when I was working with young people in public housing in a garden and cooking program. But my relationship to this work around nourishment and food justice, starts with my family history. I'm an Indo-Caribbean immigrant, and I was raised in a large family with a large extended family. So I've got 3 sisters. So we are descended from exploited Indian laborers who worked the colonial sugar plantation of British Guyana after the end of British slavery. So this acknowledgement of our history that we started with is so powerful for me, just knowing how far back our relationship to land and food goes. So when my family immigrated to the US, we used commodity foods. We needed food stamps and free and reduced price school lunch. But I also developed a love of good food because of my mom's wonderful cooking. And I ended up spending many years being a professional cook, among many other things. So right now I'm based in San Francisco, and with the magic of Zoom, can appear all across the country. So the title of this session is Community Nutrition through the Lens of Trauma and Resilience. And a brief introduction for community programs. So why brief? Because as much as we want to get to solutions and things we can do right now, we've learned over the years that trauma-informed care is about making a deliberate and long-term commitment to exploration and inquiry, especially when it comes to food, because food touches so many facets of our lives. So I will not be giving you a to-do list of how to do trauma-informed nutrition. This is an approach that asks you to draw on your own wisdom and guidance, through your own exploration, and also learning about your community. So trauma-informed care rests on our ability to deepen our awareness and understanding. So that is the piece we're going to spend most of our time with. But also I'm going to give you some glimpses into where applications, where you can start to apply certain practice and habits. So again, it just takes time and depends on the relationships you build and also the collective efforts. These are not strategies and actions that are about the individual or individual work alone. So I want to urge you to approach any work you do with this lens with patience, self-compassion, and humility. So there's so much, like I said, about this topic. Today, we're going to lay the groundwork. So I'm going to explore how positive and adverse experiences shape well-being in the relationship to food in some particular ways. There's many ways, but we're going to kind of touch on just a few of them. And then reframe how we approach nutrition and health from a trauma-informed perspective and just challenge maybe some of the common narratives that are in our society. And then begin to think about how to engage others in our work from a trauma-informed perspective. So first, let's get grounded in the meaning of food. I hope most of you had a chance to do the survey that we sent out on the meaning of food in life. So if you did, please, keep that in mind. You can always do it afterwards and we'll send it out. I'm sure Becky will send it out again, or it should be in your email. So the goal was to get you to think more deeply about what food means to you and how it fits within the broad, the different domains of your life. So there are 5 different domains covered in this survey, and it's a validated survey. It's part of a piece of research. So we had health, so how much you believe having good nourishment through food ensures your physical well-being. Aesthetic, how much you appreciate the artistry and beauty of good food and the dining experience. Moral, so how much you're concerned about doing the right thing for society or animals or the environment when it comes to food. Social, that doesn't need explaining. And then sacred, how deeply your spiritual beliefs and sense of a higher purpose are reflected in how you eat. So this is not a test. This is it's kind of a self-survey. There's no right or wrong answer. So just take a minute to think about what has shaped your relationship with food over the course of your life. What kinds of things happened in your life that resulted in the answers that you gave? And think about how you learn to eat and cook, what you eat now, how you shop, who you eat with, how you prepare food. Is food a meaningful part of your day, or is it just something that needs to happen? Or is it a combination of both, like me? You don't have to give it, you don't give it much thought, or you don't have to give it much thought. So there's no wrong answer. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to share some of the data around this survey. So like I said, it's part of a research study. So this data is pulled from the health domain and it's filtered by generation. So we've had at least 1,500 people already do this survey over the years, and we like to look at the data broadly. And it's not about drawing conclusions, but just bring some curiosity. So if you could see the titles, what do you notice about the scores from the first question compared to the other questions? So you could see that there's some differences between the first question, which asks about how we eat, and the next 3 questions which ask about our feelings around eating healthful food. So every age group showed a difference in how we value eating foods that support our health and our actual practice. But you could just see how kind of certain age groups have sort of bigger emphasis on those things and what they really emphasize. And then here's the social domain, which I find really interesting, by the community which you're raised in. So if you're rural, suburban, urban, and if you notice the orange bars representing the urban participants ranked highest in the social domain. So maybe in the chat, if somebody could share what they think might be a reason, or you can unmute. I'm fine with that too. Feel free to unmute. What do you think that reason might be? And this is not about getting the right answer. This is just about thinking out of the box.
I'm just making an assumption here, but is it because urban areas just have more populations of people? So there just tends to be more socialization that happens than in a rural area where there's fewer people in between? That's just a guess on my part.
Yeah, it's a good guess.
That's exactly what I was thinking. We live in closer proximity, so we're yeah, like my neighbor is just on the other side of that wall. And so
Right. Right. Urban life is so much more about, spending time with a lot of, you're just forced to spend time with other people due to space. I say that as a former New Yorker and how on top of each other we are. Anyone else have any other things to add about that? Also, in my head goes to sort of the ways different communities, the rituals different communities have, and maybe rituals around food or traditions. And, the activities that rural versus urban communities do. And I feel like could be some connection there. There's probably just a lot more restaurants and public eating places in our urban community. So it's just, interesting to think about where we grew up, our generation, and so on can help shape our relationship to food. So now think of your strongest domain. And think about how it shows up in the way you eat. So for me, for example, I value health. Not the only thing, but I value health. So I actually enjoy eating lots of plant-based meals. And that's not the only reason why, but I eat them because I also value health and I do enjoy the taste of them. So that's an example I would give. And then think about how you interact with others in your personal or professional life, and how that might show up in those interactions. So with that health domain, I am often the person bringing the salad to the potluck. I've gotten known for my salads, I have to say. I'm pretty proud of that. So again, this is just a little opportunity to reflect. And actually, we're going to try to do this a little bit with an interactive platform called Mentimeter. So in the chat is a link to Mentimeter, or you can also go to, let's go to the next slide. There's a QR code, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code there. And we're going to do this sort of live feed of our responses so we can kind of see them all together. So let's get on there. So I'm going to wait for folks. So first, okay, so think about your strongest domain while people are getting into Mentimeter. So let's vote. What is your strongest domain? Let's see how people are in this group rate. And if you didn't do the survey, just take a guess. Interesting. Okay. Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's go to the next question. So you're going to type an example of how it shows up in the way you eat. I don't know why that box is there. Health, for some reason, says health. Oh, so people are typing. Okay, I see. So share an example. So share a story. Like, how does it show up in the way you eat if health is your value? What's an example of what you do around food, what you eat, how you eat, and how your domain shows up? So if you go to the next, if folks having a hard time with this. Oh, there we go. Okay, it just takes a little time to feed for the screen to pop up. Great. So you see some meals passed down by the family. I don't want to eat what I cooked because it doesn't look good. So aesthetic is important to you, but you can't get the aesthetic right. Yeah, interesting. So if the food contains protein, so you eat a lot of food with protein, traditional dishes. Social. So a lot of health folks and social folks. Great. Yeah, luckily I can cook because I did it professionally, because otherwise I don't know how well I would do at the health, feeding myself healthfully and enjoyably. All right, so let's think of another example as it shows up in your personal and professional interactions. Can you think of a time, this might be a little harder, you value a certain set of experiences in a certain set of values in your food. Can you think of a time when it really was apparent in an interaction you had? I can say that even though I know it's not a best practice with my kids, I can be kind of that eat your veggies kind of parent. You show love by cooking for others, bringing food to work often, bringing in treats, not always healthy. Table bacon, oh wow. I've had colleagues point out how oddly healthy I am because I bring loaded fruit and veggie foods every day. Wonderful examples. Yeah, that feeling of being proud because you can do a nice dessert and beautiful dessert. I see somebody mentioning when people only eat for fuel. I'm wondering if when you encounter, if you're a person who values food in sort of a number of ways, when you encounter people who only eat for fuel, how you interact with them. That's always this curious question for me. Well, thank you everyone for sharing. I'm gonna stop here. You guys got the hang of Mentimeter and I loved seeing those examples. Close this out. So now that we did that little bit of exploration, I'm gonna find all my little screens here. So most people here rated health and social as their strongest domain. But for some of us, the moral, aesthetic, or sacred meaning of food is less common. So who had those? And maybe unmute or in the chat, what's one way you've honored the moral, aesthetic, or sacred meaning of food? So the rest of us can kind of hear an example of that. I saw somebody said sacred. I'd love to hear about that. Our culture is a lot less spiritual in some ways, or at least involved in spiritual rituals. So
I was someone who wrote sacred,
mm-hmm.
And I'm Jewish, so just part of our culture and part of our traditions and religious beliefs are like, it's mostly centered around food, like almost entirely. So I was just raised that like that's a way to look at food, and you're supposed to like give thanks and be have gratitude for every single little piece of food that you eat. Even like there's a prayer just specifically for water.
Wow.
So yeah, that's that kind of stuff.
Thank you. I did not know that about a prayer for water. Thanks for sharing that. So yeah, go ahead. Eugene.
Mine is not so, it's not sacred, it's more of a moral issue. When you think about these huge farms, and watched a documentary, it's probably about a year or so ago, and it was this huge pork farm in Louisiana, I believe, and just how the people in the surrounding area, they were sick, literally sick. And because from the smell and those the runoff pools and all of this. And so I think about that when, and I do eat pork, but I'm conflicted sometimes when I think about, of course, these big chicken farms and barns and all of the and the things that come along with, because it's unnatural, so it's going to have its effect on us as humans, the way that it's processed, or the way that they're raised, and that type of thing. And I'm probably rambling, but that's what comes to mind in all of this craziness when it comes, for me, when it comes to food. So it is a bit of a moral conflict for me at times.
No, Eugene, that is you highlight something really powerful. We have our values, and then there's what the environment and the world provides for us.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the communities that we are probably working in. Most of you are working in, they hold these values too, but their access to the things that feed them are maybe much more limited. And
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing that also the stress for you as a person who may hold moral values around food, and not having a food system that provides those things and feeds your interest in justice. So
Right.
Yeah, no, you brought up a great point.
Yeah.
So we really want to touch into this multiple meanings of foods in our lives. And also that not one is not more important than the other. Even though in our work, we really want to heighten and bring more, empower people around the health domain. We have to build a healthful life around acknowledging all of these domains. So I'm going to share a little bit more about this questionnaire, just quickly, and why it matters. And there's the journal article, if you're really interested in reading it, we'll send out again. So the questions that were asked were about distinguishing between our short-term immediate demands around food, so pleasure or just filling our bellies, versus the longer term considerations we have, right? The sort of when our bellies are full, when we feel like, when we're not really just thinking about the immediate, when we're thinking kind of more bigger picture. Those are the questions, and that's really what healthful eating is about. It's about thinking beyond just those two kind of immediate primal needs of satisfaction and pleasure. Another thing I want to say, about this is the industrialization of the food system has shifted our relationship to food over human history. So before our modern system, food was integrated into our social and ecological worlds. And so we would have had more of a spiritual connection. And, of course, the social as well. The health may not have been such a big one, for example. So, the modern food system has really changed things for us. And we were actively producing and preparing food. So the meaning of food in our lives was really extended among many more domains. With modern food production and marketing, we are maybe disconnected from the multidimensional relationship to food in more ways, and steered towards consuming food in a transactional way. So for pleasure, for filling our bellies, or simply as a source of nutrients to prevent disease. And I want to distinguish from that from food as a source of just health. We've been messaged that food is a source of nutrients to prevent disease or prevent being, to sort of craft a certain body. And even our healthcare system often speaks about food only in this way. eat the right thing and then you'll get this. But this is really divorced from how we truly live and what we need to thrive. And human beings thrive by making meaning. And so the question we've been asking at Leah's Pantry is, would it be more impactful and effective if we promoted meaningful relationship to food rather than just trying to encourage, the elimination of unhealthy foods, or just really just thinking about, only prioritizing health? So I'll share an example of how of this that we came across. So one of our executive director was doing work with Chaldean Iraqis in San Diego. And during a class, they were talking about breakfast, and she was shocked to hear that although these women who are recent immigrants ate very traditional diets for dinner, they all ate Special K in the morning. So, that during that time, Special K was running all these ads on TV claiming that eating Special K would result in losing weight if you followed certain rules. And so that advertising tactic just really reinforced this transactional nature of food. Whereas, in that community, food might have had a sort of a different meaning, and among those moms, the relationship would have been different. But of course, they had many put on weight during their path to the U.S. The disruption of their cultural food ways led them to kind of put on weight, and they all jumped on this diet. And then they were all watching television constantly to improve their English, and so they had a really high dosage of like this transactional relationship to food. So this slide is not about saying whether Special K is good or bad, but rather how food can be put in this more transactional light of eat this, then this will happen. And this is the message we're trying to kind of unearth and decouple our work from. So, what if we engage these moms in talking about their journey and what food means to their community? What if they explored the changes they're making as immigrants? What if they were able to openly acknowledge the cultural meaning and values of Iraqi cuisine? Would they begin to look beyond the marketing to feed themselves? Could they feel a greater sense of ownership of what they eat and how they eat? Even as we're talking about, how to eat healthfully in the American food system. So in our work, we really want to push against that transactional nature of food, where food is just about sort of these immediate choices where you eat what's available, you eat something to make you feel better, or with this illusion that you're going to get the Special K body. So we want to appeal and connect to our communities when we move away from this nutrient-focused view in food and connect to the relationship to food that we have within ourselves and our communities. But there's another reason to have these conversations about the meaning of food. We know that the most powerful tool for healing from trauma and adversity is to make meaning. That is sort of the core practice around trauma therapy. And this extends beyond just healing the broken or damaged relationship to food that is often caused by trauma. This is about meaning making is just part of recovering from all kinds of damage that is caused by trauma and adversity. So in a nutshell, at Leah's Pantry, we really believe that cultivating a multi-dimensional relationship with food can be protective and healing and drive positive and flexible and sustainable health promoting behaviors. So with this grounding, let's move on to talking about how nourishment and this idea of meaning intersects with trauma and adversity. So here you see the term PACEs. And so, I don't know, you can put in the chat or raise your hand if you've seen the term PACEs before. Yeah, I see some hands up. So, PACEs stands for positive and adverse experiences. And why I'm using this term will be clear in a few moments. But first, let's pause for a moment to consider what trauma and a trauma-informed approach is. So what are we talking about? And you may have heard this already. So in a trauma-informed approach, we do not ask the question, what's wrong with you? Instead, we might ask what happened to you with curiosity and compassion. We're also talking about that trauma casts a long shadow over mental and physical health and the ability to live the life you want to live, especially when it experiences children. This means that something that happened to us when we were young can just have consequences throughout our entire lives, even if those circumstances we're no longer poor, for example, or we're no longer with it, in an adverse environment. And we often just think of trauma as only having emotional impacts, but trauma is really a physical condition. So, but in a trauma-informed approach, looking at what happened is not the end of it. So trauma is not just the event or even what happened to you, but also what didn't happen. So we understand that if bad things happen to people and they're not surrounded by love and support and protection, they're more likely to have trauma, and recovery is more difficult. So this is easy to understand for all of you because of your background in childcare, but we know that how dependent babies are on their caregivers for food, for comfort and soothing. And adults, this is true for adults too, the presence of other people and social support is very important to survival and thriving. So when these things are not around, we are more likely to suffer trauma. And in fact, the data shows that regardless, of how many, adverse experiences somebody has. So they've researched people who have not had significant adverse experiences, but they have also not had significant positive experiences that allow them to flourish and be well. So they actually don't live longer. So people who've had adverse experiences, but have had enough positive experiences often have had better outcomes. So we are, and a lot of folks are shifting the language, from just talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, to include PACEs, or positive experiences. So simultaneously thinking about what causes trauma and what prevents and heals. So enough positive experiences are what is needed to create resilience. This is the counterpoint to trauma. So Dr. Michael Unger writes that resilience is both the capacity of individuals to navigate their way to the resources that sustain their well-being and their capacity individually and collectively to negotiate for these resources to be provided in culturally meaningful ways. So it's not just about the ability to cope with hard times, which is true somewhat. It's something deeper. And it's not just an individual skill or trait. It's about both individuals and the collective obtaining internal and external resources to survive and thrive. So in our work, we're not just thinking about how to prevent trauma and adversity, but how do we support resilience? And we can do it really well with food education and food programs. All right, so to do that, I'm going to take you through the 5 R's of a trauma-informed approach. You might have seen that, but we're going to apply it to our understanding of the nutrition and health. So the 5 R's are a set of assumptions that underlie trauma-informed approach that was created by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And we've elaborated upon it to include resilience and to just include this language of PACEs. So the first R is to realize that the impact of adversity and positive experiences. And we've come to realize that positive and adverse experiences often affect people's health status, behaviors, and then their relationship to food, community, and land, and then self. So let's look at that just briefly. And we're going to talk mostly about adverse experiences. So, it's pretty broad what's an adverse experience is, and there are things on this list that aren't, there are probably things on here that are missing. So, we have the loud traumas or crisis events. So abuse, neglect, catastrophe, violence. And then there's the quiet events, microaggressions, structural racism, just difficulty, living in poverty. And so we have to kind of take in that scope. But how do you think these adverse experiences might relate to food? So there's some that are explicitly food related. So we see here food insecurity, and just lack of access to food, lack of access to nourishment. But, so there's some others that we might not see. For example, poor water quality might be linked to an increase in sugary beverages, or increase in food insecurity can increase the cost of purchasing water and other beverages, which can eat into the food budget. And then, it can create a fear of drinking water in certain communities, from the tap water, that the fear of tap water that might linger when there's been a environmental event, or like a fire, for example. So we want to think that somehow these experiences could really affect someone's relationship with food. So repeated exposure to adversity, especially for the developing child, can cause significant harm to the physical and mental health communities. And this comes from, and you all have heard this, but this actually comes from the ACEs study, which is a study about obesity, which we may not always know. And Dr. Felitti found that obesity and other health problems are actually rooted in past adverse experiences. So previously, we believed that these illnesses, physical and mental health illnesses, were either hereditary or personal lifestyle choices. And all of a sudden, we started to see that there's something else. There's a new era of understanding that sustained or repeated exposure to adverse experiences, especially without sufficient support from caregivers or communities, often the root of poor health. So and he calls obesity, is it a problem? Is it a solution, or is it both? And I think you can guess that he really started to see that it is a solution. It is both. And what he found, that if you look at his paper, was that individual behaviors around eating were rooted in the body's stress response. So people were actually following his protocol, which was a weight loss protocol, they were losing weight. They were kind of self-sabotaging. They were dropping out, and he couldn't really figure out why. And he came to the conclusion that people were attached to their eating behaviors because they were a solution at the time to their trauma. So we think about behaviors as a response to the stress response, but we also want to think about the signs of trauma and how it complicates our understanding of the mechanisms between dietary intake and health. So adverse experiences cause what we call a toxic stress response in the body. And this impact is especially acute when it's experienced in children. So, through these hormones, this overactive stress response can impact all of the organs of the body. So we can see, impacts on the nervous system, on cardiovascular system, the immune system, the endocrine system. And so these diseases, regardless of health behavior, of dietary behavior, can be very directly connected to that stress response. But if we look at something like, the impact on the nervous system and the impact on cognitive impairment, on self-regulation, memory, attention, anxiety, and depression, those kind of nervous system impacts, then we have to think about how that might affect behavior, an ability to plan for meals in advance, to budget, to think forward, to resist those highly satiating foods that get marketed to us, and then to do this all in the midst of everyday stress. And the other thing is, trauma disrupts our endocrine system. So the damage to metabolism, which is how our body converts food into energy, even if somebody is doing all the things you're supposed to be doing, like eating, small portions or a balance of foods, we know that weight gain or the struggle to lose weight is much more difficult. And that trauma, even though it's pervasive across societies, across income levels, is definitely more of a concern in the communities where there's high levels of poverty, racism, environmental pollution. So this picture has to be part of how we think about nutrition. I'm going to touch quickly on, also multi-generational trauma. So it's not just in the immediate experience of the individual, but it's across generations. And, the science of epigenetics is really extremely fascinating, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. But the research on epigenetics, which is the mechanism by which experiences affect gene expression, shows that one experience in one generation can affect subsequent generations and be inherited through genes. So, for example, experiences of violence or famine or poor diet can result in other illnesses further down the line. Descendants of Holocaust survivors are more likely to develop PTSD. And lab studies, there are a lot of other studies on other populations, but some interesting around lab studies show that descendants of undernourished rats are more likely to develop obesity when fed a normal diet. So we can't identify exact genetic pathways just yet. But let's look quickly at cultural pathways. So we think about historical trauma and how it can impact communities by, eroding just their sense of dignity and their autonomy. Language, ancestral land and farming and ritual and traditions, stability, and just trust in community systems and states. And how these things feed and wealth, sorry. And then I'm thinking about how these things translate into how subsequent generations are able to maintain their well-being, sustain themselves, and thrive. And this is, of course, if it's not obvious, really linked to how people feed themselves and their relationship to the foods they eat. I also don't want to forget that communities also have these communities also have experienced incredible acts of resistance and resilience, or else they wouldn't be here. And these also become part of a culture and community. So really showing again how we have to look at these trauma and resilience, positive and adverse experiences in relationship to one another. Now, if we go into recognize the second R, the takeaway is that if we recognize that the signs of trauma and resilience, if we recognize the signs of trauma and resilience, we have to reframe our understanding of human health and behavior through the lens of trauma. So as those of you who work with kids, hopefully you are able to look at some of the disruptive behaviors or shutdown behaviors in your classroom as either rooted in trauma or just rooted in the still developing nervous systems of young people. So it could be both. And so just I want to keep that in mind as well. But a trauma-informed lens just really allows us to see the roots of emotional health, physical illness, and just difficult behaviors as an understandable part of the stress response or as traumatic adaptations. This is an important thing to remind ourselves of. So when we talk about health, especially nutritional health, adversity, trauma, and toxic stress can upend our plans for healthy practices, which I mentioned before. So first, when there's been trauma, individuals might seek the biochemical regulation of food. So food is a collection of chemical substances. So it has properties, neurological properties. These properties such as flavor and texture, cultural and emotional associations, chemicals, they all serve to regulate feelings. The stress response or trauma might mean people have learned different lessons and priorities about priorities and risks. So the short-term considerations when there's trauma may be more important than long-term ones, right? Survival. So one is not better than the other if your life has been experienced in sort of bursts of traumatic in experiences. So people may seek safety and control in foods that are familiar and consistent and pleasurable. And then, of course, adversity may mean that people have different kinds of access and information and resources that may affect their decisions about health and food. And then to top it off, we have this environment, the marketing environment, especially in areas where there are high rates of community ACEs. It feeds the stress response. And I think we should argue that the lack of quality food is an example of community adversity. So stress creates a strong propensity to consume many of these foods. And then, of course, the built environment and the businesses and the market forces can capitalize on it. So there's a double whammy. So we may have a perception of choice, and that's certainly how things are sold to us. But how much choice is there really when we're operating on this sort of subconscious level? So I don't know if you're all familiar with Resmaa Menakem. He's had some really good, his work has come to light over the last few years. He calls for us to see personality, family traits, cultural habits within the context of traumatic experiences. And that over time, either within a person's lifetime or through the generations, they kind of, it appears. So, you know, as I've said, the science of trauma and neurobiology shows that most health and social problems are not because of individuals, but the result of the complex interplay of biology, wiring, and our environment. And many of these previously unexamined beliefs and messages about well-being, success have created unnecessary, damaging shame, stigma, and othering of people who suffer or struggle, making it even harder for them to take care of their well-being. So we really have to hold that in our minds as we're helping folks along. So before we get stuck on just all this sort of overwhelming picture, let's start to think about how we can capture opportunities. So one of you submitted a question to Becky about what is healthy, and that's a really great question. So if we're going to reframe our health behaviors, illnesses, or challenging behaviors, we need to redraw our images of health and well-being. So body weight has become unjustly our primary indicator of health. But health is not just the absence of disease and diet. And then diet and exercise on their own are not the way to achieve it. I'm going to tell you from the nutrition world, we're learning that lesson the hard way. Diet and exercise on their own are not going to achieve health. So health includes and is achieved by having loving connection, joy, new experiences, and a sense of belonging. And so health really has to be reframed in this context of resilience. So I'm actually going to pause here because I want us to take a little stretch and take a little break as we talk about resilience and how resilience can be part of nutrition work. So take a moment to digest. Becky, you want to send folks off?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Let's all take a 5-minute break. We'll just ask you to monitor your own time and come back at, let's say, 6:32. And while we're on the break, I am going to pause the recording. And I'm also going to repost the sign-in sheet and see if that is working for folks. Thanks.
And I like to play a little music while we're on break, so I'll do that.
Great. As everyone's coming back into the call, I was not able to correct that sign-in sheet, so please just direct message me in the chat, or you can email me at becky.krieger@hilltopcc.org. I put that in the chat. Just let me know your name, email address, STARS ID number, and yes or no to a training certificate. And I'll repost that again in case anyone missed it.
Are you ready to resume yet?
Yeah, let's go for it, Monica. And Monica, you're free to begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. So I am not going to even go through my whole spiel on protective factors because I'm fairly sure you all are well versed in this aspect of things because it has to do with child development. And I want to say, you know, our take on protective factors, of course, these are not all of them, right? But, you know, the research on, you know, around, you know, caregiver resilience, you know, knowing child development, providing social connections, and all these things here on the left. There's plenty of research showing that that is what builds resilience and protects children and individuals and communities from adversity and toxic stress. And then on the right are some of the qualities that are developed if a child and a person has those factors. And then in turn, you know, when someone has social and emotional competence, when they're of service, when they're feeling a sense of belonging or value, self-efficacy, a sense of collective responsibility and cooperation, they can contribute back to building a resilient community. So we really see this picture of, you know, developing protective factors is an individual and a community effort, and it really requires connection and relationships. And that nutrition work or working with communities around food can really provide really vital opportunities for building these protective factors. So I'll get into that a little bit, but I know that you all have so much already that you do in this space. I want to look at a couple of them and just hear from you how these protective factors either show up in the community or among the children you're working with. These aren't all of them, of course, or how you might be building these protective factors with your community, either with kids, adults, parents, coworkers. I want to hear your stories, how you've been interacting with some of these, where you might be seeing them in your life. And so we have parental resilience, concrete support in times of need, social and emotional competence in children, a sense of collective responsibility and community connectedness, a sense of being treated as special, as valued, and then traditional knowledge and cultural values and practice. Can I hear from a couple of folks?
Hi, Monica.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Jill Cruz. I am a teacher from Hilltop Children's Center, and I'm in a 3 to 3-year-old room, 3 to 4-year-old room now. And I'm looking at sense of collective responsibility and community connectedness. We have an educator in our class who especially, I give him a lot of high praise because he is very well versed in bringing the children into the garden and into our community garden outside on the playground and talking about, well, first of all, with spring, talking about where our food comes from, starting with how we use the seedlings, the cucumber seedlings, how we plant them, and then actually putting them into the patch and then watching them grow. Like, for example, today he took them out and he had some of them count the amount of snow peas we had growing. And not only is it a great way for early math skills, but it's obviously helping them be more connected with the earth and also with the food that they enjoy, and kind of encourage them to take adventure bites when they might not want to have something that's green, and encourage them to smell, taste, feel, touch, all these different aspects of the garden, and just encourage them to be more, I guess, connected with where their food comes from, and then so many avenues of learning from there.
Thank you, Jill. As you're talking, I came to this work from food and then entered into the child development space. I think you all are already doing this work, but need to have it framed around food, and you're already doing it and it's already happening. And just that, seeing it is kind of a really important step here, but I just want to acknowledge that. Thank you. Does anybody else want to share an example? Well, in case you're looking for some research around this, I will share a little bit of research around, how supporting protective factors that lend belonging, dignity, pride, connection, all of these things can inspire healthy behaviors. So, this is a piece of research where it's an intervention that wasn't just about teaching young people not to use drugs, but it really emphasized ethnic identity. And it showed lessened drug use among young people. So integrating that protective factor along with the desired health behavior saw really great improvements. And we've seen this around the country around different nutrition programs where this approach of, integrating into connection and relationships has potential for really strong improvement in health. So, one way that we can be doing this is just reclaiming and celebrating traditional foods and culinary heritage. So honoring the ways that diverse foodways are nourishing and healthful, even as we're talking about new information and new habits, right? So if we just break open the standard models of healthy eating to include traditional and indigenous diets, like kale is not superior to amaranth or collard greens or dandelion greens, even though we've been marketed a lot of kale. And meals don't have to look like, if you've seen the USDA My Plate with the protein and the grain and the vegetables, that does not have to be the meal. And so we can start there. I want to share, a picture, a model that we've developed of how we can really compose a fuller picture of healthy nourishment, upon which we base sort of our goals and our approach to teaching about health and nutrition. So first, nourishment has to rest on having reliable, desirable, and dignified food resources. So that is an important part of the picture that I don't want to dismiss or even, make insignificant. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. So into being able to provide that safety and security around food resources. So if people don't have this, the other things above are going to be on shaky ground. So we have to, at least, even if this is not part of our work, recognize this reality for people, because people need to have their reality seen. Then we can look at the emotional dimensions of the next level. So this is the next place where we, just look at the bottom line. So, the emotional dimensions, where nourishment is achieved through experiences with food that build culture, identity, joy, relationships, autonomy, and competency. So there are different ways we can do that in connecting people to their history, to telling stories about food, experiencing joy and gratitude and sensory experiences, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Fostering relationships by cooking and eating together. And this cooking skills and food literacy skill building piece, where we're really emphasizing autonomy and competency, and building strength and independence. And we can do this at a very young age with kids. And then when we look at the next level, we can get to the goals and the skills that are really about kind of practicing healthy behaviors and doing healthier things for our families and our communities. So this is when we can think about practicing nutrition for a healthy body and mind, or even protection against stress, but really thinking about your food choices and your exercise habit. We can also practice self-regulation, and think about mindful eating and self-aware eating and movement habits, but ones that are joyful, and nourishing others, and what it means to nourish others, or feeding your family and you're feeding your community. And then there's this other piece of advocacy. So, opportunities for people to confront and recognize the impact of social and economic systems on our food. But these things have to be built on sort of the others, having, the safety, and then having this emotional relationship, and then these, I don't want to say higher level, but kind of longer term skills and longer term awareness. All right, now we're getting there. So the next assumption that I'm going to talk about, and really takes into these final 3 R's in sort of a bigger way, that a trauma-informed approach supports recovery, resists re-traumatization, and leads to resilience by meeting meaning human needs for safety, connection, and growth. And so how do we help manifest this model of trauma-informed nourishment that I just shared? This is sort of where I'm going to go here. So first, I want to remind us that this is a collective societal response. So we're be doing our part as professionals within systems, but we're not meant to be doing it alone. So everyone has a role to play in trauma-informed care. So, the person who answers the phones and the person who drives the school bus, all of them are part of this system. But I'm going to talk mostly right now about just, your work, our work as care providers and practitioners with children in the communities we're in. So we like to say that trauma-informed approach to nutrition requires that we think about what we do to reduce stigma, shame, confusion, and tension, what we do to promote confidence, dignity, and joy, how we inspire a compassionate and flexible relationship to our bodies, each other, and our material lives, so like food, and then how we're just fostering other protective and healing practices beyond good food. We know good food, healthy food, is also a protective and healing practice. So I don't want to let go of that. Nutrition doesn't matter. Nutrition does matter. And we need to think about how we want to get there. So we want to turn this lens on ourselves. We want to recognize that individual and communal experiences, positive and negative, affect us. So this is why we talked about our own relationship to food earlier. We want to upgrade and constantly upgrade all of our abilities to be in relationship with others. So hopefully, as those who work with kids, you are thinking about relationships first, because and how we are in relationship. We can't support others if we're not able to regulate ourselves, and then kind of have positive and safe relationships with others. And an important way to do this is really applying nervous system and body-based intelligence to our policies and practices and how we care for others and ourselves. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit in a little while, and just a little bit. But this is it's a whole other area of understanding that that we want to develop, and how our nervous system and how our bodies are connected to ourselves. So I'm going to touch on 2 things. There's so many ways to do this. I'm going to touch on 2 things. I'm going to talk about a strength-based frame and the neurosequential model. And if you've heard of the neurosequential model, chime in, put it in the chat if you have. But I'm going to kind of briefly introduce it, because we use both in our work with adults and with kids. So first, let's look at the strengths-based frame, and we're going to go into some breakout rooms to do this. So get ready. This is a way for us to reorient ourselves to thinking and talking about food and about ourselves that is empowering rather than diminishing. So we want people to feel restored in their power, because adversity can really diminish it. So let me put some context into it. So there were 2 questions that were asked again in the registration. So we had a question: do you have any tips, talking points on the intersection of this topic and white saviorism, which is an interesting question. And then this other person said, I would love to participate in a group discussion on assumptions on family needs for children in low income and how we can provide the best for the whole child and the family in a culturally sensitive way. So what the common theme I see here is, how do we tap into cultural humility so that we help people in a way that doesn't stigmatize and harm their cultural identity? This question alone really requires a deep dive. So first we have to kind of work on our biases and remind ourselves that we have biases and how our own experiences shape our worldview. So again, the meaning of food and life questionnaire is really relevant here, as well as other kind of reflective practices. So you're really starting to think about food and the different relationships one can have to it, and how our own relationship to food is embedded. And then we must recognize the power of protective factors, and that resilience already exists, but how can we build and amplify those things? And we can do this by taking a strengths-based approach. So we're going to go into some pairs. And we're going to have a little conversation with these two questions, these three questions. And the reason why we're going to do this is that we're so used to thinking about our own health, our own weight, our own diets from a deficit-based frame. So we might most commonly have had conversations about losing weight where we focus on what we're doing wrong and what we need to change to be better. But what if we were having conversations where we tapped into what we did right and how we did it? So I want you to experience this and practice this for yourself. So we're going to go into pairs where one person is going to volunteer to be the interviewer and the other person will be the interviewee. So think for a second which one you want to be. And I'm also, in order to do this, I think we're going to need to come onto camera so just we can interact with each other if we can. I know that might be difficult. I know people have dinner hour as well, so I want to respect that. But hopefully we can spend like about 10 minutes in these small groups. What do you think, Darlene? Is this doable?
Absolutely. I think we could figure it out.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm Becky and Darlene. Yeah, thank you. So let's take a minute. So think if you are really itching to be the interviewer, and I'm putting in the chat a link to the questions that you're going to be asking. So we're going to just really, if you're commuting, if you're doing things that you just can't take your attention away from, just listen in. But maybe we can go into groups of 3, maybe, since some folks will be off. I don't know how you want to set it up, Becky.
Yeah, I think, Monica, in order for me to just open the breakout rooms, I think you might have to stop sharing your screen.
Right. Okay.
There we go. And let's see, we'll do 6. We'll do 7 breakout rooms, and folks can just jump into a breakout room. Yeah, I'm thinking if you're a person who is not able to be on camera or communicate right now because of commuting or life situation, maybe you can just stay in the main room with me and Monica. And yeah, maybe Monica and I can even interview each other, and folks who can't participate could just listen in on that. How's that sound?
That's great.
Okay.
So again, the link to the questions are in the chat, and I'll send it out again.
And once you get that invitation to join a breakout room, you can just join whichever one is available there.
So I see a couple folks alone in rooms. Can move them into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll move some folks together here.
The breakout room dance is always always
Uh-huh.
time.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so far the rooms that have folks in them seem to all have 2.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm fine with us doing it, Becky.
Yeah.
Be the interviewer or the interviewee?
Oh, let's see. I'll be the interviewee.
Okay.
Fun.
So I want to start by understanding how you might describe your healthiest, happiest self and share what that means to you.
Mm-hmm. My happiest, healthiest self is the first one that comes to mind is well rested. Eating food in a way that feels nourishing and pleasurable and joyful. Sharing food with others, absolutely. And moving my body in a way that feels joyful, that feels like a little bit of a challenge, and that feels not forced, but kind of meeting me where I'm at and where my energy's at. And close relationships, absolutely.
Thanks. So can you think of a recent time when you were able to eat in a way that really aligned with your idea of health? You know, what were you able to do and like, how did it make you feel?
Before I answer that question, Monica, I'm just going to put a couple folks in breakout rooms.
Okay.
Because I think some people are waiting to be assigned. So I'm going to give that a try. Okay. All right. If anybody else would like to be put in a breakout room, please just speak up. All right. Okay, and could you repeat your question? Sorry about that.
Yeah, so can you share like a recent time when you're able to eat in a way that aligned with your idea of health?
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
Yeah. It's such a great question, and interesting that I'm struggling to answer it, because I think about what did I eat today. I felt like most of what I ate today was fairly aligned, but I get to this dinner time like witching hour where I often don't know what to cook, or I'm too tired to cook, or like right now I'm in transition, I just moved, and don't really have everything set up to cook. So part of me wants to say, oh, I felt like that was today. And I know I still have this dinner time hour where I'm probably going to be struggling again to figure out what to eat. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how that's a common occurrence for me lately.
To sort of have worry over what's going to happen.
Yes, yeah. Like, am I going to eat something that's going to feel good, that I'm going to feel good afterwards after I eat, and that is going to feel aligned with, with my food values, I guess. Yeah.
But has there been a time you can think of, like an example of when you were?
Yeah. I think a time, I don't have a specific day in mind, but the days when I've been just sort of eating intuitively, like eating when I'm hungry, eating what feels good in my stomach, eating what I feel called to eat, and having a mix of kind of eating on my own and enjoying food, but also sharing food with others throughout the day. And there's also a piece in there about the times that I've been able to just sit and focus on eating rather than trying to quickly put food in my mouth while multitasking or getting somewhere. So times that I've been able to eat slowly and on my own schedule too, has felt really, really aligned, felt really good.
Can you say a little bit more about how that it felt?
Yeah, I mean, it just felt like, it felt peaceful. It felt like I was doing exactly what I wanted to be doing. I felt really in my body. I didn't feel distracted. And there was joy and pleasure. There wasn't any guilt or second guessing what I was eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can identify that. So if you think about those moments, like what made this possible? What set you up for success, or like how did you receive support from other people?
Yeah, what made this possible was the freedom of setting my own schedule. So the times that I've had an experience like this have often been on a weekend when I haven't had work necessarily or other big commitments. So yeah, freedom to set my own schedule, close to payday. So just got a fresh deposit in that checking account and not feeling that stress or tension of having to make sure that there's enough money in there for groceries or eating out. Yeah.
How about
and just the access too, like where I live, like I can easily walk down the street to the cafe or the brewery with the food truck, or I can get to the grocery store fairly easily where I live. So I think those are definitely like the three main components.
Was anybody involved, like people in your life that helped make that happen as well?
Yeah, definitely. My partner is part of that. Hanging out with a friend, I often find that that experience of eating is so pleasurable because we're sort of making food choices together. Like, oh, where do you want to go eat? Or where do you want to go sit to have our lunch? Or yeah, having supportive people who have some of those shared values around food.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, so I'm bringing everyone back.
Thanks, Monica.
Yeah, thank you so much for being the interviewee and sharing all of that.
Yeah, great questions.
Okay, so let's see. Going to return to a little debrief.
Everyone's just about to come back.
Okay, so just a few comments. How did it feel as an interviewee? Did it feel to be asked these questions? And the second question, how is it different from being asked about what you eat or being told to eat certain foods for your health?
A lot different for me. And it made me think about just the experiences around being healthy. And I had a great experience, went to a vegetarian dinner party, and I'm thinking, oh goodness. And I shared that with Darlene. I'm like, I'm gonna leave here just as hungry as I can be. but, but it was a neat experience. He's an accomplished cook with his just the salad and all of the things that went with it. He made like a zucchini like spaghetti and with a pasta, but I can't think of the green sauce, and it was very good. He did do salmon for those who, and I'm thinking of, but it was awesome.
Eugene, you're killing us here with the menu.
Yeah, it was a neat experience
Yeah.
to have, and so if it's like that, I certainly can do that, but it's gonna have to be a big learning curve on me, learning to cook that way.
Yeah. So when you had that interview, what was it like to be talking about that?
It just brought up some good feelings, a good, it was a good experience, and really it makes me think about my health and healthier eating, and I appreciate that. I know that it's a good way to be as far as eating a little healthier and everything, and not to be asked for it to be asked in that way.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Not a
Right. Yeah. Brianne.
Mhm.
Monica, as the interviewer, I know that wasn't on there.
No, interview time and tail.
I did really appreciate the story that was being shared, because it also allowed for Jean and I to connect. And then we were just reminiscing like, oh, now you have to go and connect with your friend that we were just talking about, because the story was so personal. And it just, I could see that it warmed his heart in a way that it was bringing joy to tell the story. So it became a positive thing talking about the food.
And maybe a reminder for Jean to access a similar kind of opportunity for a healthy meal.
Absolutely. I was watching it. They were preparing spaghetti squash, and I was like, that's gonna be hard. But it was like the way she did it, and I'm like, I could do that.
Mhm.
So.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I see Brianne has their hand raised. Her hand raised.
Yeah, hi. It was really interesting to think about these questions from such a different framework, and to reflect on how like the food that I have been eating over the last 5 or 6 years or so has remained fairly consistent. And I feel like I have a healthy relationship with the type of food that I eat, but it was really interesting to then reframe it more about the relationship with the food that I eat, about how has the way that I've cooked changed over the last 5 or 6 years, or how, the people I'm cooking with or not cooking with affects my relationship with my food. How often I have the time to cook. So it was really just fascinating to delve beyond, am I getting my protein and vegetables and grains, and think more about, okay, well, how much energy do I have now based on how much I'm working and this type of work that I'm doing to cook the kind of meals that I cooked 3 or 4 years ago, and how has that affected my relationship to those meals? So I've really appreciated that opportunity to look at all this food from a different angle.
Thank you so much for the rich answer. Anyone else want to share their experience, any insight they gained from doing this?
I think I really appreciated that you were asking first, like describe your healthiest and happiest self outside of food. Like food isn't a piece of it. Like I'm a person who actually has a pretty negative relationship with food and health and all of that stuff. But to be able to think about like, how do you see yourself as your healthiest and happiest first, and then how does food relate to that? I think it was a nice approach.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't get fully into all the questions, but yeah. I appreciated that perspective.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, yeah, this was just sort of a taste of what that experience can be like. So using these strengths-based strategies really is about creating meaning, right? And so I said earlier, like meaning making is how we kind of develop sustainable, healthy, nourishing habits. And then you can identify key opportunities or challenges or questions that empowers people, that people can kind of isolate moments that they can capitalize on or look at. And it allows each of us to explore our own context and think about our own lives, which is, how important it is to make our experiences relevant. And in order to really kind of, own our relationship to food or anything. And these kinds of conversations, as providers, we think they really reduce opportunities for implicit bias. This conversation is participant-led or people-led. It's not coming in with a bunch of assumptions. So, just a little taste of what that can be like and what that might feel like for our engagement and our relationships with people in our work, in our lives. So I'm going to jump to something else because I like to share, I know because you all are also looking for tangible things for your classroom and for your students. And given that there's some limited time, I just wanted to see in the chat or hands raised if you have heard of the 3 R's or the neurosequential model. Any of this, you can raise your hand. Let me see if I can see in the chat, because I don't want to be too redundant. Okay, well, so I'm going to play this quick video about the neuroscience of the 3 R's or the neurosequential model. Just spend just a little bit of time talking about how this practice, this framework can really bring us some approaches to our work. So play this here.
The Art of Yoga Project is a nonprofit that brings trauma-informed yoga and creative expression to vulnerable, marginalized, and system-involved youth. The youth we work with have significant histories of trauma. The trauma has negatively impacted their development and led to behaviors that perpetuate a troubling cycle of violence and victimization. The mindfulness-based practices we use at the Art of Yoga Project can help youth to become more self-aware and learn to self-regulate. This will help to repair their trauma. How? It's all about their brains. The human brain has 3 general areas: the lower survival brain, the middle feeling brain, and a higher learning brain. We draw from the Child Trauma Academy's research, which uses the 3 R's: regulate, relate, reason, to add corresponding functions to these 3 brain areas. We regulate with the survival area, relate with our feeling area, and reason with our learning area. When we are stressed or experiencing a traumatic event, our brains are designed to adapt. We downshift into our lower survival brain, activating our fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms to survive. But when we are deep into this part of the brain, we shut off our higher feeling and learning regions. This emotional state makes it challenging to connect with people or take in meaningful information. Basically, we can't relate or reason because we are busy trying to regulate. The youth we serve have had chronic, unpredictable traumas at times when their brains were developing. This means that they have built many brain pathways in their lower survival brains and very few in their relating and reasoning parts. Additionally, the pathways created in their survival brains are disorganized. We call this dysregulation. This makes it hard for them to handle their emotions, attach to others, or learn in school because they are constantly trying to keep themselves safe. They are basically wired for stress. At the Art of Yoga Project, we meet youth where they're at, knowing we must first help them to regulate so they can transition from their survival brain and connect with us and their peers in their feeling brain, preparing them for learning in school or engaging with other programming as they activate their higher brains. So how do we regulate? With yoga and expressive arts. Let's talk about how this works. Turns out that this survival area is also the part of the brain where we take in our 5 senses. So we can intervene here by helping youth to turn their attention to what they are feeling, seeing, hearing, and smelling. We call this practice sensory integration. We use the practice of trauma-informed yoga and a whole range of art and writing projects to help youth to integrate their senses. By using their senses to come into their bodies, they can become present in the moment. If we are in the present, then we can't be in the traumatic and terrifying memories of our past or the fear and anxiety of our future. And when we can take the time to breathe and be present, we can help youth to move up from the lower survival centers and into the higher connecting learning areas of the brain, allowing their whole brains online again. Over time, youth can learn to do this on their own. As they self-regulate, new, healthier neural networks or brain pathways are formed that help youth to self-regulate. Once regulated, they can form healthy relationships and learn with more ease. We can then cover topics like yoga's guidelines for living, essential life skills, and even brain science. Now the youth can fully engage with the world around them. Instead of reacting, they can be responsive. They take the time to pause, breathe, and think about the best course of action in this moment and into their promising futures. This is healing. This is accountability. This is empowerment. This is the Art of Yoga Project. This is how we use neuroscience and mindfulness to heal trauma. Over the past 15 years, the Art of Yoga Project has served 10,000 youth in juvenile detention, substance abuse recovery, agencies serving commercially sexually exploited children, level 14 facilities, and alternative and gang-impacted schools. The foundation of our evidence-based approach is the neurosequential model of therapeutics, which guides our mindfulness-based interventions.
Okay, so in, a very, very brief period of time, I'm going to cover some pretty dense stuff, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version because this is a whole other topic for, further exploration discussion. But I really want to talk to you about this model and how we can adapt it into everything we do, every piece of education we do, but specifically, activities around food and nutrition and building that relationship to food. Yes, and I'll share that link. So basically the brain is regulated from the bottom up, and we, and this is a model created by Dr. Bruce Perry, so you can look at his work. And so in order to get to this area of the mind, what we call the mind or the thinking brain, we have to think about what the body needs to regulate, and then what the limbic area of the brain is, where we relate what that needs to regulate, and then we can kind of activate the more evolutionarily younger part of our brains. So we have to regulate the more primitive, quote unquote primitive, but essential parts of our brains through the body, and then and through our emotions before we get to this newer part of the brain. So, we may think that we are in that upper part of the brain even as adults most of the time, but we're not. We're mostly regulating on these lower parts. And for children, this is even more pronounced because their upper level parts of the brain have not developed yet, and they don't mature into their 20s. So for children, especially, being in this these bottom two triangles is super important, and working within that. So I'm going to quickly show some of the ways that we do that. So we regulate through movement, and probably the most important thing you can do to regulate that part of the brain. We do, as the video suggested, sensory experiences, mindfulness, but food and nature and water, right? So we can we can apply this to in workshops or programs around food, where we're doing food tasting, and where cooking and eating are regulating just on their own. Or you could do mindful tasting and sensory tasting in a workshop, or when you engage with kids or adults. The next level, right, is how we can relate. So we can relate. Relating requires a bunch of things. All of these things here: empathy, opportunities for play and joy and wonder, newness, creativity, and risk-taking, and autonomy. These are just some of the ways that our emotional needs for relating to ourselves and to others is activated. So in our programs, we can incorporate creativity with food, and again, cooking. I'm going to keep talking about cooking and why cooking is such a rich experience. This idea of risk-taking and autonomy, this is where giving kids tools, and giving people tools to chop and use materials that they've never used before, or try materials and take a chance on something, is another way you can really engage with folks around nutrition and food. And then if we're going to engage this level of the brain, so after we've done the regulating and relating, how do we interact, and how do we help make learning and reasoning and reflection in that intellectual part of the brain become engaged? And we talked a little bit about meaning making and making things relevant. The kind of quality of the learning experience is so important. But I just want to remind us that really for children, it's those lower levels that are so important to engage. So just a sort of a shortcut way to look at this is, from the body to the mind, starting with mindfulness and movement and sensory experiences, and then going into relationships and joyful experiences, and also choice and voice and autonomy, and developing those, having that, and how we have to build up before we get into that learning and that meaning making. So for example, actually there was a question around that someone raised around, can you see the question? Let's see, there it is. How do we as a society and people that work with children engage with the land we live? And how do we highlight not just our nutrition of the land, but also the rights of children to engage with in the land and all that provides? And I think this 3 R's employing that is a really wonderful way to kind of embody all of those aspects, or starting there, especially with children, and to engage them in their natural sense of belonging to the earth and to the land they live in, and then connecting to food. And what comes to mind with this question really is, and somebody raised gardening. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can maybe do this with gardening. So gardening is just a whole body, whole being experience. So there we go with how, something you're already doing or could be doing and may not have thought about is a trauma-informed practice. So, gardening with others. Gardening allows for mindfulness, movement, sensory experiences, ways to build relationships and have joyful experiences. And then just working in nature and making things grow is a way to make meaning and build skills. So it's the whole picture. So I'll give a couple examples, with the body. You can do a garden walk and have your kids touch and pick and taste things, and feel the soil. And then the next around emotions, you can then pause and share out an observation and then vote on an activity where they do work in teams, so that relationship piece. And then you can do something, some learning about the original inhabitants of the land and what they grew, and then maybe cook something with that ingredient. So just think about the rich and lively conversation you can have with that. And you're probably doing much of this already, but now you can think of it in the context of, yes, this is trauma-informed work, and be more intentional about it, and really elaborate more upon it, and really see what are you bringing to your students when you're working in this way. So I'm going to pause here. I know there was a lot to listen to, and there's so many questions, more than answers maybe, that I shared, but I want to give you this resource here, Paces and Nourishment, which is if you were following ACEs and Nourishment, the ACEs Connection website, there's now a page on there for thinking about ACEs and trauma in the context of food. And then you can also just reach out to me at leahspantry.org.
Wow, Monica, thank you so much for this incredibly rich presentation this evening. We've gotten a few requests in the chat for your slides. I'm wondering if you would be willing to share those with me afterwards, and I could email those out to participants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm putting the links in the chat now, but yes, send them out as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, wow. It's hard to even know where to begin. I know what I'm taking away from this workshop is a lot, but especially what you kept coming back around to about this idea of meaning making through nutrition, and that it's not just the food pyramid, and it's not just the transactional relationship that a lot of us have developed with food because of the culture that we live in and the marketing around us, and for many of us, the trauma that we may have experienced, but that we can get back to that place of meaning making with food, and also removing that layer of judgment, that whatever relationship we currently have with food, it has served a purpose, and there is meaning within that current relationship. So thank you so much. I realize we're just about at 7:30, but I'd love to open up the floor for anyone to offer just a final appreciation of Monica, of this presentation, or any final insight or something you're taking away from tonight.
Thank you for summarizing it so beautifully, Becky.
Very thought-provoking, just to think about that. I had an opportunity to go horseback riding, and so the place that we went to, it's a recovery. The men are recovering, and the horses are part of the therapy. And so this is what this kind of makes me think of when you talk about moving and movement, and then having that connection. So, and especially with children, with the days that we live in, to have as much as we can do to quell some of the trauma that they are experiencing, and that we ourselves are experiencing. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. And thank you all so much for being here, Monica. This was incredible. I will be emailing all of you with Monica's slides and some follow-up notes and resources. Don't forget that Hilltop Institute has a couple more events coming up. We have one on June 18th in just a couple of weeks, another one in July and August. So you can check out our Eventbrite page, and I'm going to quickly put the link to that in the chat. And anyone else who didn't get a chance to give me your STARS ID number, please do just go ahead and email me. And I'm also willing to stay on a little bit longer to talk with anyone who needs to get me that information. But thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your night. And thank you all so much for the important work that you're doing with children and in your community. And Monica, thank you for spreading this wisdom.
Again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Good night, you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Right. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah. That was a really wonderful experience, Becky. I hope you have a good your night.
Yes, thank you, Monica. That was really incredible. Yeah, thank you so much.
I will PDF the slides and
Great.
send you an email with all the links that people requested.
Perfect.
Tomorrow.
Okay, that sounds great. How was it on your end? How was presenting?
It was wonderful. I mean, I just, people seemed just, I know it's a challenging time of day, and I just loved that the level of engagement we did get was so great.
Yes, yes,
Thoughtful, and
really
so
was.
thoughtful, so incredibly thoughtful. So
Very much so. Yeah, I thought it was a very successful experience. Yeah. Okay. Well, Monica, thank you. I'll look for your email, and yeah, have a great rest of your evening. I look forward to connecting again.
yes.
Okay. Good night, Monica.
Right.